What is happening, Sly Gang? It is Lord 3rd, your number one trash player, aka the Garbage Goat, aka the Lost Boss. Recent leaks suggest that, in addition to Persona 6, Atlus is working on a remake of Persona 3, the first Persona game. I love Persona 4 and 5, with 5 being in my top 5 games of all time. I even made a whole video about it being the game of our generation. Wink wink, nudge nudge. But when I heard about the Persona 6 leak, I just felt worried. It wasn't because of a delay, it wasn't because the game was going to be bad, it's just that we have a Persona problem. See, back before Persona 5 dropped in 2016-2017 for the world, Atlus had found middling success in most of their SMT and Persona endeavors. At the time, most of their SMT releases were for handhelds, with Strange Journey in SMT 4 and 4 Apocalypse only being released for the Nintendo DS. On the other side, ports of Persona games only made it to the PlayStation Vita and PSP depending on the time of release. At the time, in 2017, the only mainline games for either series to have been released on a console were the games released for the PlayStation 2, SMT 3, and Personas 3 and 4. Now, depending on who you talk to, SMT 3 either underperformed or was an adequate success from Atlus. It wasn't blockbuster by any means, but I like to believe that, and this is speculation, allegedly, that SMT did okay, but not great, barely making a profit, and certainly not doing as well as they wanted to overseas. This is important for one specific thing. In a 2005 interview with OneUp.com, art director Kazuma Kaneko, when asked about games like SMT3 and Digital Devil Saga's performance in foreign markets, the States and the UK primarily, Kaneko replied, "Of course I want our games to sell more, but I've also got to consider that the culture in North America is very different. If you ask me what I think about our game sales in Japan, I like to think of Shin Megami Tensei games as rock stars or singers and punk bands, whereas blockbuster games like Final Fantasy are more like the Academy Award winners. We have our own fans. Naturally, I would like to see a similar phenomenon occur with our games in the United States." I think he means the Grammys, but I get the analogy. The distance between local and foreign sales is recurring for game devs and publishers. Trying to create a game that has a mass appeal is very difficult, as market trends and desires can be vastly different between continents and between demographics. This was the truth in the aughts, leaving a looming question: how do we appeal to the global audience? But the shift began to occur with the release of Persona 3 in 2006, a few years after SMT3 was released and re-released. Whereas the success of Shin Megami Tensei 3 was debatable, the performance of the third Persona game was undeniable, garnering multiple RPG of the Year awards and nominations and having improved sales over its SMT counterpart. With the differing setting, gameplay, and overall design of Persona 3 setting P3 apart at the time and performing better in Western markets, greenlanding a sequel was a no-brainer on Atlus's part, as Persona 4 was released 2 years later, which saw even greater success. And that was where the problem began, in my opinion. See, at the time, the Atlus execs said, "Tell him I need 2 of them," and realized that with the success of Persona 4, it had become a more recognizable IP outside of Japan, and in 2008 was also the point when a lot of Japanese anime and manga culture was becoming more ubiquitous on a global scale, with Crunchyroll in its second year of service and Naruto quickly becoming the biggest anime in overseas markets, as Shippuden had premiered a year before in 2007. All of this fueled a growing market for people who were a fan of media that carried anime tropes and aesthetics, all things that were staples for the Persona games at the time and continue to be, but they were absent from many mainline SMT games. Where SMT games had a more mature, more serious tone, Persona really leaned into many of the shonen and shoujo tropes. This, along with the lower barrier of entry with a lighter overall aesthetic and lower difficulty ceiling, these games were much easier to introduce new people to. With a more globally successful series on their hands, Atlus made a few calls.
"Hey listen, I quit."
The next plan of action for the company was to spin the success into a greater profit. In 2011, Persona 4 became the first title to receive an anime adaptation, spawning both a 26-episode series following the core narrative of the game and a condensed movie. The game then saw an enhanced version released in 2012 for the PlayStation Vita in Persona 4 Golden, this time with sales of the game being the strongest premiere release of an Atlus game at the time, eventually doubling the overall sales of Persona from 350k for the original PS2 version to 700k after sales of Golden were released. Atlus, not one to seize the opportunity, said,
"Hold on, wait a minute. Y'all thought I was finished?"
And you know how I talked about the desire for Atlus to spin success? Well, it only makes sense that a company purchased by Sega would spin Dash into a series of spin-offs, licensing the IP for a rhythm game, a fighter, whatever the Persona Q is. The company went all in with Persona and it was working. Each game proving to be successful, and even though they had varying levels of success, they even retroactively created spin-offs in the same vein of Persona 3, and would serve to integrate them together with the Persona 4 games, like Persona 4 Arena and the original Persona Q. From 2011 to 2016, Atlus released 6 Persona games, either ports or spin-offs. But how many Shin Megami Tensei games did they release during that time? 2. And the second was a sequel to SMT4. While SMT4 had a warm reception, being highly rated and selling 600,000 units, its sequel did not perform as well, amassing less than 2/3 of that number at 370,000 units. Meanwhile, even some of the spin-offs of the Persona games would perform similarly or better than SMT4 itself, with games like Persona Q Shadow of the Labyrinth selling 790,000 units. With the disparity in sales, especially overseas, it was becoming more evident that Persona was the more marketable series, especially with spin-offs of the series performing just as well as the main game of the series at times. But if you were a gamer in 2016,
you never see it come back.
Persona 5 shipped in 2016, marking the first mainline game of either SMT or Persona to hit a console since Persona 4 in 2008. Within a week, Persona 5 had sold 337,000 units, making it the fastest selling game in the Persona series, and selling in 1 week nearly as many units as the original Persona 4 sold in its lifetime at that point. With a global release in 2017, Persona 5 would go on to sell over 2 million units, dwarfing the sales of any other Shin Megami Tensei game, including its spin-offs. With Persona 5 receiving numerous award nominations and ample praise, Atlus had a certified hit on their hands, and this time, that hit was global. With this newfound success, Atlus was able to push this momentum into making a new experimental game that hadn't been done before. But why would they do that when you can throw spin-offs and DLC at your new audience while reporting older titles? Over the next 4 years of the 12 games released by Atlus, half of them were Persona games and only one of them SMT, and it wasn't even a numbered series game. While Strange Journey is fairly well regarded, it only sold 280,000 units. By the time SMT5 was released in 2022, Persona games had dominated much of Atlus's development, and I believe the impact of Persona had made changes to how Atlus developed their flagship RPG. On top of being shipped with DLC that was never built upon, its focus on teen protagonists and their connection to the school seemed a bit too reminiscent of Persona games. While this isn't uncommon for the SMT series to have a fairly young, high school-aged protagonist, SMT5 spent an inordinate amount of time in and around the protagonist's high school and with poorly developed high school friends who became the major representatives of the law and chaos routes of the story. SMT5 ended up selling 1 million units, which, while a success for Atlus, paled in comparison to the success of just the original version of Persona 5 at over 6 million units. Go on to add the sales for Persona 5 Royal, Persona 5 overall has sold over 9 million units. Just last year, Atlus released the certified bottle game Soul Hackers 2, which, while not an SMT mainline game, is representative of a core issue that I'm trying to express. Atlus has gone all in on Persona, while all other games just seem like an afterthought. Shin Megami Tensei 5, while fun and overall enjoyable, had some glaring flaws, especially where the story was concerned.
Dude, I get to protect Tokyo? How cool is that?
Though there was a significant focus on the open world addition to the game, some of the other elements of the game seemed to suffer from the shift in focus, from the repetitive combat, weak writing, underdeveloped story, and unsatisfactory challenge. And Soul Hackers 2? Yeah, that game was ass. Terrible writing, poor game feel, excruciating gameplay, and uninspired dungeons. SMT5 had more variations in its dungeons, and it only had 3 of them, which arguably is the same amount that Soul Hackers 2 had, because 3 of them were just reskins of a previous dungeon. But this isn't my rant about Soul Hackers 2 being terrible, even though it was. Why am I saying all of this? Do I want Persona 6 to do well? Of course I do, but do I want Persona 6 to do well at the detriment of Atlus's other offerings?
Hell no, to the no.
Atlus had been one of my favorite developers at one point. All the way back to Mach-N X on the Dreamcast, I've always found myself intrigued by the worlds that they created in their games. While I understand the need for companies to make wise decisions based on what consumers are wanting, I think that eventually the all-in approach will come up a bust. Just look at Disney and Marvel movies. What was originally a blockbuster universe of movies that stoked the anticipation of millions across the globe is now a series that receives lukewarm reception when new projects are announced. I'm a Marvel fan, and I haven't been hungry and excited for a Marvel movie since Endgame. This may be apples to oranges, as these are 2 different studios and 2 different industries, but I believe the principle is the same. Thinking that your prize stallion is going to bring home gold every time will lead to beating a dead horse long after it's fallen from grace. I hope that neither the Persona series or Shin Megami Tensei become a dead horse. I think that analogy fit. Did that make sense?
Hell no, to the no. Hell to the no, hell to the no, to the no. Hell no, to the no. Hell to the no. To the no. Hell to the no. To the no. To the no.